We're going to continue with our story. I stopped on page 47 on the first reading, but now we're going to start up. I'm going to back up just a little bit to 46 and then continue on. This is The Quilt by T. Davis Bunn. And when we left it, Mary and her daughter-in-law and some of their friends were fixing to make a quilt. And Mary had said they were wanting to make a quilt for the Lord. And Mary had said, "Not for me, child, not for me, for our Lord. This is His quilt." "Yes, ma'am, that's what I meant." "Then say what you mean," Mary said with a touch of sharpness. "I won't have a hand touch this quilt that doesn't have a heart and mind fastened on their Father." Let's back up. "Far too little thanks given these days," Mary said, more to herself than to others. "With everything the Lord gives us, all we can think of is what we don't have, like a bunch of spoiled children." "We'd be happy to do that for you, Miss Mary," Luann said, her eyes mirroring the blankness of Jody's. "Not for me, child, not for me, for our Lord. This is His quilt." "Yes, ma'am, that's what I meant." "Then say what you mean," Mary said with a touch of sharpness. "I won't have a hand touch this quilt that doesn't have the heart and mind fastened on their Father." That pretty much put a stop to further talk, but as soon as they left, the talk bubbled back up like water from an underground spring. And that night the telephone lines near to melted from the heat. "I just don't know what to think," Everett said to Jody over the phone. His brother Jonas never did talk enough to suit Everett when he was in one of his hyper moods. Talking to Jonas was like dropping a stone into a deep, dark well. You had to wait forever, and then there was only this distant plunk. Though he had never admitted it, Everett liked somebody to get all excited back at him so he'd have a reason to do his little two-step and shout till his face got red. Jody usually enjoyed Everett's little show. She knew it kept him from doing his song and dance in front of Luann too often, and it always made her glad to have married the other brother. It was awful funny looking at all those clothes laid out on the floor like that. I do believe I saw all her embroidered linens in that pile. "I don't know, sister. I just don't know what to think," Everett repeated, feeling the pressure rise. "Maybe it's time I went over and talked to the old folks' home about a place for Mama." That shocked Jody awake. Strange as Mary seemed over this quilt business, having her shipped off to some home was the furthest thing from Jody's mind. Jody opened her mouth, closed it, wondered how she could stop this before it went any further. "It's not as bad as all that, Ev." Everett wasn't so easily slowed down. "Honey, maybe you don't see how she's slipping. Living out near her and all. We ought to have one of those specialists go out and give her a good checkup. Listen to these stories of hers. Have her tell him about this call from heaven to make a quilt at her age." Jody had trouble answering right off on account of her having this image flash inside her mind. It was one of those little things that didn't usually have any meaning since she saw it every day. She saw herself standing at the kitchen sink, looking up the rise back behind their house as she did every morning while she was fixing breakfast. The sun was just clearing the woods behind her, throwing out that first golden beam. It caught Mary's white work and turned it the color of molten gold. The rain wells Jonas had put in along the roof 4 or 5 years ago were galvanized and didn't need painting when the sun hit them. They shone like a crown of light around her home. Jody stood there holding the phone and listening to Everett work himself up, and saw herself looking out the window one dawn and knowing that someone else was living up there in Mary's home. "Don't you dare call any doctor, you hear me?" The fury shocked even Jody. She swallowed, shook the vision from her mind, and said more quietly, "Don't go calling any doctor from the home, Everett." She managed to cut the man off in mid-flow. He hesitated and said, "You sure, sister?" I'm sure. That strong, no-nonsense tone she used with her children could be heard loud and clear. I'll start making it a point to go up there every day and look in on her, help her out any way I can. Everett's disappointment came through the phone. "I still think you just leave it to me. You hear what I'm saying? Mary'll be fine where she is. She has all of us family to look after her." Before Everett could think up another protest, Jody said goodbye and set down the phone. True to her word, Jody set off up the hill just as soon as the breakfast dishes were washed the next morning. But to her utter amazement, she heard Amy's bell-sized laugh ring out as she walked onto Mary's front stoop. The women looked up as Jody entered the sitting room. "Why, good morning, child," said Mary. "What a nice surprise. 2 visitors so early on a morning." Amy was sitting on the oval hook rug, the clothes from the pile spread out around her like a pastel rainbow. "I got to thinking about this last night and didn't think I'd ever get to sleep. I just couldn't wait to come out." "Always nice to have company at a quilting," Mary said in her quiet way, "just so long as you all remember to pray as you work." "Mama?" The sight of 3 neatly folded white items laying there in front of Amy stopped Jody in mid-flow. In a shocked voice she asked, "Aren't those Papa Joe's shirts?" "His Sunday go-to-meeting shirts," Mary agreed. "Only things of his I kept. Found them this morning when I was rummaging through his closet." Jody turned round eyes toward Mary. "You're going to use Papa Joe's Sunday shirts in a quilt?" "Can't imagine a better place for them," Mary said firmly. "That man prayed the better part of every Sunday in those shirts. I think he'd like the idea of seeing his church clothes being stitched up in a prayer quilt." A prayer quilt. Despite herself, Jody had to admit that the words had a nice ring to them. A prayer quilt. She sat herself down in the other chair by the window to let it all sink in. "Miss Mary was just telling me about when the children were still young," said Amy. "It came to me this morning," Mary said. "Strange how something that happened over 40 years ago can look clearer to my mind than what I had for breakfast this morning. I was laying out those shirts there and recalled how Jonas—" She stopped to give Jody her memory-laden smile. I mean my husband, honey, not my boy. Every Sunday we'd walk up the rise from church, and before he'd go into the house, Jonas would always stop by the well. We had running water even back then, first house in the country to put in inside water. Jonas had the man come by and drill down beside the well. Then he laid copper piping to the kitchen, but he always said the water never tasted as nice out of the pipe as it did straight from the well. Mary's eyes misted over as she looked out in front of her and saw what was meant for her eyes alone. He'd haul the bucket up on that worn rope. I was after him to the day he died to put another rope on. Some day that rope was going to break, and then he'd have the dickens of a time trying to fish it out. That well must have been all of 80 feet deep, but he'd just smile that slow smile of his and tell me there wasn't anybody interested in that well but him, and he liked the way that old rope fitted to his hand. Mary paused to wipe her mouth with an age-spotted hand, then went on. Everett was always right there beside Papa Joe, screaming to be picked up so he could drink too. Jonas had this way of drinking that just seemed to go on forever, stopping to breathe that long sigh between each draught, like to have drove that boy crazy having to wait till Papa was finished before he'd pick Everett up and let him drink too. For some reason, Jody saw her own children, had a little kaleidoscope of images all crowding there in front of her eyes. She saw the little things that touched her heart so, and tried to imagine what it would be like to look back in 30 years and realize that all those special times were over forever. over and gone, yet even when they were there, the strains and pressures of the moment often washed all the joy away. A lot to be thankful for, Mary said softly, her eyes focusing on the room once more. She turned and smiled a sad, sweet smile for Jody. The Lord been awful good to me. Good to all of us, Jody said, though she had a little trouble getting the words out. That's the truth, Amy said from her place on the floor, her eyes a little misty too. And that's what we're here for, isn't it, Mary said, her voice gathering strength. We're going to sit here and thank him for all these wonders, every cut, every stitch, every piece we lay down. Each one's going to have its own little prayer to help set it in place. Doesn't matter if this thing takes us 20 years, that's the way it's going to be. It's a real strange feeling, Jody told her husband that night. I got down on the floor and started cutting and felt, I don't know, kind of uncomfortable at first, sitting there with my scissors trying to cut straight and pray at the same time. I couldn't think of anything to say, and I sure as goodness couldn't look Amy in the eyes. I was sure if I did, I'd break out laughing. It felt so funny. Jody had a way of talking to her husband that was born of long years of talking as much to herself as to him. Jonas was such a quiet man, he'd sat for as long as she held him with her voice. The dinner dishes piled up where their oldest boy had sat. The kids upstairs raising Cain, all excited because they had been freed from their usual routine of kitchen chores. Whenever Jody had something to talk to Jonas about, she sent them upstairs with the promise that if they weren't quiet, she'd be up soon enough to put them to bed. But they had learned long ago that if they gave the elders 20 minutes of relative calm to get deep in discussion, they could peel the tiles off the roof without much worry. Jonas was a carver. It was his only real hobby, and he tried to spend at least an hour or so at it every evening. When the house was quiet and the kids in bed, he'd pull his little tray out from under his favorite chair and sit and carve. Sometimes it was soap, sometimes sandalwood, sometimes just a likely-looking stick he had picked up on the way home. The first gift he had ever presented to Jody back when they had just started courting was a lovely little soapstone jewel box. "What's this?" she had asked him at the time. Jonas had replied, "Seeing as how you're going to carry my heart around with you, I thought you might need something to put it in." He had all of these tiny instruments, some made for carvers and some coming from a jeweler friend who was always after Jonas to let him sell the pieces. Every time the jeweler was over, he walked around picking them up and inspecting them and shaking his head. "What on earth are you doing?" he asked Jonas, "letting the kids play with these things?" Jonas replied with an easy smile that looked so much like Mary's in the words, "Just letting my children enjoy them the only way they know how." Whenever Jody sent the children off and started on one of her evening talks, Jonas would walk into the living room and come back with his carving tray. He might look up once during the whole time she talked. He just sat there, his face set in those calm, expressionless lines, and carved. It amazed Jody how those big, hard hands could be so gentle, so careful, so patient, and so gifted. When she was younger, she used to try and force a reaction out of him, ask him direct questions and badger him, always trying to draw him out of that placid shell. The last time she'd tried it was the year before their first child was born. She lost her temper a bit, frustrated by his eternal calm, and half shouted that she could just as well read the telephone book out loud to him as talk about something really important. Jonas looked up at that and said the first words he had spoken that evening. "That's just not true," he said, and the calm force behind those words startled her. "But you never say anything," Jody told him. I've never been a man with much to say," Jonas replied. Jody asked, "Well, do you want me to stop talking and be quiet too?" As long as you want to talk, Jonas replied, I want to listen. I love the sound of your voice and the sound of your heart coming out with the words. Jody had long since grown accustomed to talking to her silent man and had made two interesting discoveries along life's road. The first was that a silent listener like Jonas could draw her deepest thoughts out better than the world's best talker. It was at times like these when she had said something from the deepest part of herself or spoken out a revelation which came from somewhere else that Jonas would look up at her and smile, what Jody had always thought of as Mary's smile. The second thing she discovered was that not only did Jonas really listen, he remembered. He would come to her days and sometimes even weeks later and mention something she had said in one of these talks. She would spend a couple of frantic minutes researching her memory for what he was referring to, then spend a good while afterwards thanking the Lord for giving her such a man. That night Jonas was working on one of his little men, a gift for their daughter. She had a veritable army of tiny friends, each one about the size of her 6-year-old hand. They remained lined up on her dresser until time came for tea parties and long afternoon chats. Jonas' jeweler friend refused to go into their daughter's room at all. He said looking at all those little fellers going to waste up there gave him indigestion. Jonas had the tray set in the place where his dinner plate had been, his sleeves rolled up to expose wiry arms and those big, work-strong hands wrapped around a little steel carving hook. He'd pick a couple of times, blow, inspect, flick at the spot with a tiny smidgen of sanding paper, pick some more, and listen. Jody had long since learned that he always listened. But you know, this praying while we worked was something real important to Mary, Jody told her husband. I could tell. She stopped every now and then and read from that big old Bible, then go back and cut some more. And the way she did it, honey, it was like something out of a slow motion picture. She had cut just like this. Jody made sure Jonas lifted his eyes before cutting the air in excruciating slowness. I couldn't watch her for long. It just drove me crazy. You know how I am. There's so much to get done in so little time. I swear I don't even know what I'm doing up there at the house with so much to do around here. Jody bent her own head and started making little slow motion designs on the tabletop with one finger. I don't know how long I was up there, but after a while all that stuff just stopped mattering. I don't know as I can explain it, but it was like everything just slowed down. All the things I've been worrying about, Timmy's problems at school, and the car, and the chores, it just went away. Jody lifted both hands and pressed against her forehead as though trying to squeeze the memory clear. I was thinking about when Betty was little and got so sick, and how the doctor said he wasn't sure she'd get over it, and how tired we both were when she started getting better. You remember? I remember, Jonas said softly. Jody raised her head and was surprised to find him sitting there and watching her full on, the carving and the tools set aside. She could never recall having seen that before. She collected herself and went on. I just started thanking God for healing our little girl. I started to apologize for not having said it sooner, and then stopped myself, because Mary said we weren't supposed to say anything but thanks. So I thanked him for quite a while. I think it was right about that then when it started feeling like time was slowing down. Jonas nodded as though he understood, just a tiny nod, but a nod just the same. His expression didn't change, it almost never did, but his attention was focused on her with an almost frightening intensity. We were laying out the patterns, trying to get the colors to match, we were going to do a flower design with the central circle and 14 petals coming out. And you know, whenever I've done a quilt with others before, there's always been a lot of talk and comparison and gossip and argument too. Everybody has their own idea of how they want the pattern laid out. Jody found that the intensity of Jonas's gaze somehow made the memory come alive for her once again. But this time, honey, there wasn't even any talk. We just laid it out as we wanted, almost in turn. And I really think every one of us was praying as we did it. I know I was. Then the next thing I knew, I looked at the clock on the mantel, and I'd been sitting there for almost 4 hours. When I got home, the children had already made their own lunch and gone out to play. Jonas looked at her for a long moment, then picked up his carving tool and rolled it back and forth between his scarred thumb and forefinger. "I think you ought to go back and help out as much as you can," he said to Jody. "There was something else," Jody added. "All the rest of today I've been thinking of things I want to go back and give thanks for. Everywhere I turn, it seems like I'm looking at things that I've spent years taking for granted, and now that they're all coming alive again, I might sound crazy, but even the kids seem more important. No, not that. More beautiful. No, not more beautiful. Jody," Jonas said in his quiet, strong way, "I don't know how to wait. I know. It's like when I stop and thank him, I'm really seeing it for the first time. Not like I've ever seen it before, but like I've never seen it with his eyes before. Everything becomes a gift then." She looked up. "Does that make any sense?" "I want you to go up and help out Mama whenever you can," Jonas repeated. "I was planning to," Jody said. "I really think there's something special going on up there." There's a lot of work that goes into a handmade quilt, long before the first stitch is ever sewn. Once the backing is stretched across the frame, and the front piece is chosen, and the design is selected, and the various bits of cloth are all brought out and washed till they are limp as used paper towels. Once the measuring's been done a dozen times, once the design's cut out one time for all the other designs to be compared to, once the little sheaves of fabric are all scissored and trimmed a second time, once they've been mixed and matched 1,000 times until all the colors are just as they should be, once the designs are laid out across the floor with one extra set put aside for covering the mistakes that are bound to happen, once the design pattern has been measured and drawn and cut from the front fabric, then and only then can the stitching begin. And as any good quilt maker will tell you, the work doesn't really get underway until it's time to pick up the needle. When Everett arrived 5 days later for his regular Wednesday visit, there were 3 ladies cutting out petals, one doing the inner circles, two busy drawing out the design on the front fabric, and another helping his mother stretch and pull and separate and flatten all the strands of cotton batting. And what's more, the place was as still as a church bowed in silent prayer. Everett stood on the front stoop and peered through the screen door, not sure he belonged and feeling truly riled over a bunch of strange women upsetting his routine. He pushed his hat back so as to be able to scratch the front of his balding head and pressed his face up against the screen like a little boy watching his mother bake pies on a Saturday afternoon. Without warning, one of the women started singing, softly at first, "What a friend we have in Jesus." Before she was halfway through the first stanza, the whole room was rocking to the sound of that old-time hymn. At the sound of all those voices, Everett suddenly felt the outsider, the one who didn't belong. A big hole opened up about heart level, and Everett turned and started scuffling off the porch. "That you, son?" Everett turned to find Mary at the door. "Mama?" It startled him, seeing her through the screen. It was somehow like Mary had dropped 30 years, her gentle features losing all their wrinkles and turning the clock back to when he was a little boy. Mary pushed the screen aside, and Everett felt his heart slow down as the old woman appeared in the natural light. "Come on in, son. I doubt the coffee's much good. I was up so early this morning, maybe I ought to make another pot." "I just brewed some up fresh, Miss Mary," said a voice from inside. "Hope that's all right." "Well, bless you, child. I know Everett'll be pleased." But Everett wasn't sure how he felt about it all as he let Mary take his arm and lead him into the crowded sitting room. "Y'all know my boy, don't you?" There was a chorus of yes ma'ams and a lot of sheepish smiles, like a group of little girls caught playing in their mother's closet. "Ladies," Everett mumbled, feeling totally out of place. "Mama, it'd be better if I came back another day." "Don't talk nonsense." Mary led her younger boy through the doorway and down the little connecting hall to the big country kitchen. "Now you just set yourself down right there at that table and I'll pour you a cup and we'll chat. Those ladies can take care of themselves for a spell." Mary eased herself down into the chair opposite him and lovingly guided her boy toward forgetting the women in the next room and the worries he had with his work and the problems he'd been carrying all his life. Every man needed the chance to set down his guard from time to time. She had always told anybody who'd listen. The problem was most men got so used to working in a world that called for invisible armor all the time they forgot that they were even wearing it. Once he was talking without thinking, Mary allowed herself to relax a little and just love her boy. Everett had always held a special place in her heart. Jonas, her elder surviving son, was so much like his father it was uncanny, big and held and quiet and solid. Jonas was not somebody who needed very much. Everett, poor little Everett. He'd been a sickly child, and too many of his younger years had been spent standing in the shadow of his big brother. While Jonas had grown up strong and solid as a barn door, Everett had grown out. Mary always looked at Everett's pudgy round face and fat arms and protruding belly and saw the little lonely sensitive child that needed an extra padding of protection around a heart that broke too easily for this world. She watched her Everett grow up into a young man who tried hard as he could to be one of the boys, and even when they had accepted him as one of their own, Everett had never known happiness. He'd grown up letting the others of his age mold his character and his behavior, and it seemed like only Mary could see the yearning in those sad little eyes. "Your wife was here again yesterday," Mary told him. "She's a darling woman, Everett. I've always thought of her as the little girl I didn't have." Everett's pudgy features lit up at the mention of Luann. "You never told me that, Mama." "Never told you a lot of things. It's true, just the same." As she spoke, Mary recalled something Luann had said the previous afternoon as she was leaving. The two women had been cleaning up after all the others had left when suddenly Luann had said, "I've never thanked you for Everett, have I?" Something in the way she had said it brought tears to Mary's eyes. "I was so scared when Everett brought you home that first time," Mary had replied. "There was so much need in that boy. I was scared to death he had gone out and found somebody who'd never understand." Luann had smiled at her and said, "I knew you were worried. That's why I wasn't concerned over how cross you were with me. Anybody with eyes could see that Everett was your favorite." Mary had laughed to cover how touched she was by the words. "He just needed me more than anybody else, I suppose," Mary had replied. "Who'd have thought there was all that goodness just waiting to come out?" Luann had said, "Child," Mary had told her, "if it had been a lesser woman than you, that goodness would have never existed. It took a woman with a heart of gold to make that boy come alive." Goodness there may have been in Everett, but it was not something many could see at first glance. Everett was not a pretty man, and age did not set well on him. His formerly sandy blonde hair now looked like a hard rain had rinsed all the color out. His hair was not turning white so much as it was becoming transparent. Everett's chin tended to disappear nowadays into little layers of sagginess when he lowered his head. His face blotched into shades of pink and red when he got excited, and he had the deep, gasping cough of a formerly consumptive child. People who knew him well said Everett was a good man. He just tried too hard. His laugh was forced, his good old boy style too jovial, the fear in his eyes for all to see. Everett spooned sugar into his coffee and said to Mary, "I still don't see what's possessed you to get started with another doggone quilt, Mama." "There's not a thing in the world that's going to disturb our Wednesday morning, son," Mary replied, understanding him perfectly. "Now you just put those ladies in the other room out of your head and tell me about the family." Everett hid his embarrassment behind a loud slurp of coffee. His mother's ability to see right through him had always left him feeling downright exposed. "You didn't answer my question, Mama." "The Lord shown me what he wants just as clearly as he can, son." "What? He came down and spoke from the burning bush?" Everett gave a little high-pitched chuckle at his own cleverness. "Lit up one of the magnolias in your front yard?" Sometimes after her visits with Everett, Mary would look back and wonder that the well of patience did not run dry. Mary looked down at her hands, rubbed them back and forth, one upon the other. Her voice had that quiet warning in it when he spoke. "There's not a soul on this earth who knows how many days they've got left. Not you, not me, not any of the ladies sitting there in the front room. All we can hope for is that what time we have is spent as the Lord wants us to." Mary looked up and fastened her son with a strong gaze. "I won't say this again, Everett. The Lord has told me that I am to make him a quilt, and it is to be sewn together with prayers. That is all there is to be said about it. Do you hear me?" "I hear you," Everett replied sullenly. "Can't say as I understand it, though. A lady of your age starting another quilt." "I didn't say we'd always understand what the Lord intends for us, now did I?" Mary pointed to the windowsill, said, "Reach over there for the little Bible, son." Everett turned around, saw between the hanging plants a little New Testament covered in wood from an olive tree. The sight startled him. He lifted the tiny book and recalled a 6-year-old boy who saved his pennies for a whole summer, then sent off to the mail order company for a Bible bound in olive wood from the Holy Land. It was the first Christmas present he had ever paid for with his own money. He had to clear his throat before he could say, "I didn't know you still had this, Mama." "Can't read it any more," Mary replied. "The print's just a blur, but I like to have it around me. Reminds me of a little boy I loved to distraction. Still do, for that matter." Everett kept his eyes on the small book as he rubbed his hands over the smooth, polished surface and recalled the excitement of a Christmas morning long ago. The joy over his own presence had paled in comparison to how he had looked forward to his Mama opening that gift brought all the way from Israel. "Can you read that little print, son?" "Course I can. Open it up to Romans, please, sir." Mary closed her eyes and thought for a moment and said, "Romans chapter 1, verse 21. Read it to me, if you please." Everett searched, turning the fragile pages with fingers that seemed too big and clumsy for the little volume. He read, "For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened." "Nor gave thanks to him," Mary repeated. "Isn't that something? We're not just talking about some little act we can take on when times are good and there's a few extra minutes laying about. Paul says just plain as the nose on your face that this is one of the most basic responsibilities we have. We must glorify our God and we must give thanks to Him. All the sins and all the confusion that Paul talks about for the rest of that chapter stem from people not doing those two things. I've been sitting up here growing old and watching the world speed up faster and faster until I can hardly believe people don't get dizzy just standing still. And when they come up to see me, all they can talk about is how much they've got to get done. Seems to me like they work themselves toward an early grave just so tomorrow they can rest a spell. Mary leaned closer. Son, let me tell you a little secret I've learned in these long years of mine. Tomorrow never comes. You either have it today or you don't. She waved her hand around to take in the room. I'm not talking about possessions. I'm talking about what counts. The things of the Spirit. Love, patience, kindness, compassion, and a thankful heart. A body's got to take time each and every day to thank their Lord for all that's theirs. Plain and simple, son. It's got to start today, no matter how busy you are, nor how much is still left undone, nor how many problems are piled up on your head and heart. Giving thanks is one thing that can't wait. That night, the night I realized the Lord wanted me to make this quilt, I asked myself, now what business does an old lady like me have in taking on something like this? It wasn't until the next morning when I was sitting there listening to the newsman talk about some disaster or something that I realized, came to me clear as day. It's a lesson that's been forgotten, the importance of giving thanks. And if I can help one person see how necessary it is with this work, why, the Lord's will has been done. Doesn't matter with that quilt being finished. What's important is that those ladies in there remembering what it's like to be really and truly grateful to our Lord. And I'm going to stop there on page 82 for today. And we'll come back to it another day. See you later.